Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Perhaps you've seen the shows Finding Your Roots on PBS or Who Do You Think You Are on BBC. Or maybe you visited the website Ancestry.com, all in the hope of answering the question, where do I come from and who are my ancestors? Well, you're not alone. The world's multiracial population is considered to be one of the fastest growing of all ethnic groups. In the United States, it's estimated by the year 2050, more than 20% of the population will be considered mixed race. In her new book, Multiracial Parents, Mixed Families, Generational Change and the Future of Race, author Miri Song considers how mixed race parents identify their children, raise them, and how they view their children's futures in a society that is becoming more and more racially diverse. Song is professor of sociology at the University of Kent in England and a distinguished visiting fellow at the CUNY Graduate Center's Advanced Research Collaborative. Welcome. Ethnicity and racial mixing are subjects you have been studying and writing about for years. Why?
Well, I used to be a scholar of migration, but I felt that in a way the logical extension to that in terms of looking at race relations and multiracial people was that when migrants settle and often intermarry, what happens? Then the lens switches to what happens in the aftermath of intermarriage and when you have mixed people. And I felt that really this whole topic in a way needed to go in a slightly different direction and had been understudied.
And your latest book really focuses on mixed race couples and their children in Great Britain. In the United Kingdom, I was surprised to learn only 2.2% of the population is identified as being mixed race, although that's probably an undercount, compared to 6.9% in the United States. And that surprised me because, from my visit to England earlier this year and from the British television that I've watched over the years, it seems that minorities, certainly blacks, are more integrated into television and as regular people, not as pathologies. And that multiracial people and black people in Great Britain are less stigmatized than they are in the United States. Is any of that true? Is that true?
Well, let me first start with the figures, because you raise a really fundamental issue in relation to how we count the multiracial population. Methodologically, there are a lot of problems with this, in my view, although that's not what the book is centrally about. The 2.2% that the Office for National Statistics came up with in Britain is certainly an undercount, because what it does is that only captures people who tick a mixed box in the census. It doesn't show, the thing is, we all know that people make choices and are selective about how they identify racially. And there are all sorts of people who are mixed by ancestry, but who don't tick a mixed box for whatever reason. So it's certainly an undercount. And in fact, other studies in Britain found that when they could get information about the ancestries of both sides of someone's lineage, that it was definitely higher. The figure of 6.9, I'm assuming you got that figure from the Pew survey in the US.
Yes.
That's not the same as the count that the US Census did. So the US Census estimate from the last census was 2.9. And the way that the Pew survey do it is the Pew survey is 6.9 because they've aggregated not only how people who racially self-identify, that would be 1.4%, but when they look at people's parents' and grandparents' ancestries, they came up with 6.9. So they actually took into account ancestries.
Okay.
And I think this is such an important issue because how people racially identify doesn't necessarily reflect their ancestries. And I think, as you started out, our interest in ancestries is really informing the way in which people might select, identify. And of course, some people identify as mixed and some people don't. So it's a real hit or miss situation in terms of how we count people.
Okay. Describe the group of 62 people who you interviewed for this book.
Well, it's necessarily a small sample. It's unrepresentative. What I wanted to do is the 62 people are comprised of what I see as the three most common types of multiracial people in England. So for instance, black white, South Asian white, and East Asian white. So South Asian white being people like Indian and Pakistani and white, East Asian people being like Chinese and white, for instance. And I specifically wanted people who were part white because I wanted to know what happens when part white people have children of their own, because there are all these sociologists who make certain claims about what happens when multiracial people partner.
Historically, there was a perception of the tragic mulatto, a person who is confused and doomed to have an unhappy life because he or she doesn't belong to any one group, is sort of pretty much an outlier. But you said that concept, that perception tends to be on its way out, or is gone.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that there's still people out there, both in England and in the US, who attribute that kind of pathology to multiracial people, and it is offensive and outdated. The truth is, in a lot of pockets of British society, especially in more diverse places, being mixed is quite normal. It's quite unremarkable. And I think that, that kind of pathologizing is definitely outdated. And I'm thinking of like that Douglas Sirk novel, Imitation of Life, and there's so many depictions of that kind of pathology. But yes, I think that it is, especially amongst younger people.
So it's not still considered a major social transgression for white Britons to marry black partners?
I would say that especially, I would say no. I mean, in Britain, and of course, this is not the US, because I think this is going to be, of course, subject to regional variation. There are going to be people in places, even in England, you know, in sleep little villages, where people will stare at you if you're a mixed couple. But for the most part, I would say that it's unremarkable. Black-white intermarriage in Britain is very, very high. It's, in fact, much more common, for instance, than, let's say, South Asian white marriage of Muslims, because being Muslim is a major religious divide. And historically, there's been, like, in a sense, a kind of working class white Irish intermarriage with black Caribbeans, and also more middle class white people increasingly.
Are there more mixed couples in Britain than in the United States, do you think?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Certainly black-white mixed couples.
Right.
I mean, I think in one recent study, it was estimated that almost half of black Caribbean men who are in a relationship have white partners, and almost a third of black Caribbean women in a relationship have white partners.
It is true, however, that in Great Britain, there's been some research that found that British children who are a mix of black, Caribbean, and white are disproportionately in foster care.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, that when black Caribbeans in Britain marry white, the partners often tend to be working class as opposed to middle class. So I guess one might conclude that having blackness as part of your racial makeup might signal a, I don't know, lower socioeconomic level and some of the problems that come with that.
Well, as I was just talking about, I mean, I think that there's a kind of bifurcation of mixing, so that you'll have two tracks. I mean, you'll have, it's what you just described. What's most common is, let's say, a black Caribbean man with a white working class woman, okay? And there are high rates of fostering. On the other hand, we see that mixing for more educated white and black and Asian people is really not uncommon, and you'll see different kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds of
Which brings
partners.
us to Prince Harry and the engagement of Prince Harry and
Inevitably,
Meghan Markle.
Yeah.
So, how did the mixed race British parents tend to classify their children in terms of racial groupings?
Well, you know, I'm obviously only going on this small sample, but one of the things that I thought was striking was that of the 62 parents I interviewed, 40 of them insisted that they would identify their children as mixed. Now, the only thing that surprised me is that there were some people in the sample who had minority partners, okay, with whom they shared a racial ancestry. Most people had white partners, but some of the people didn't. And I actually thought that the people, let's say black, white people in the sample who had, let's say, a black partner, would possibly say that their child was black because of the shared ancestry. But everyone I talked to insisted that they would say that they were mixed. And
In
of
fact,
course,
nobody identified their child as belonging to
a single monoracial minority.
Right,
I mean,
right.
some people did say that their children were white, and there are particular reasons for that. But I personally think that, I'm sure there are people out there who would say, my child is black or my child is Asian if there was a shared minority ancestry. But I was struck by how strongly people subscribe to the idea of mixing and the need to recognize all of their child's ancestries on both sides.
Okay. And there was a group that described their children as white. I assume if the children would have to look white, you know.
Yes, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. Nobody of the 14 out of the 62 people said that their children, they would identify their child as white. And that's striking because 46 of the 62 people had white partners. So conceivably, with shared whiteness, they might have gone for white or mixed. But anyway, the people who chose white were people who all had children who looked white. And in fact, it was very clear, and all the studies show, that people are not going to say that nobody can feel that they can claim whiteness on behalf of their children unless they looked phenotypically unquestionably white. Mm-hmm. Now, the same wasn't true in relation to people who claimed the children were mixed. Some of the people who claimed that the children were mixed had children who were white,
right.
But they insisted that appearance should not dictate the claim to multiraciality. And there were a number of people who struggled with that a little bit, who were uncertain, and the whole theme of ambivalence and uncertainty was very strong. But a lot of parents were just absolutely principled about saying, my child is white, my children are mixed,
right,
despite a white appearance.
Right.
Yeah.
You found out something about how they chose to raise their children in terms of racial identity, and there were 4 different ways. What were those?
Well, it was mixed. Well, there was
British.
The main British. There was British. There was kind of a minority emphasis, and a cosmopolitan emphasis was the most common emphasis. Really.
What does that mean?
I would say that the thing that I was struck by was that people who claimed a cosmopolitan emphasis they didn't want to privilege any one particular ethnic or racial background, okay? So for instance, I'm thinking of this person called, we'll call her Dominique, these are all pseudonyms. She was a 47-year-old woman who had a Chinese ancestor and a white French parent, and she said to me, well, we don't do French, we don't do English, we don't do whatever. Her whole thing was about saying that we embrace being a kind of inhabitant of
the world,
right. And so there's this whole transcending kind of discourse and language and mindset, and what she wanted to emphasize to her child was, I mean, in no way was she disowning the fact that she had white and French ancestors, but that Chinese and white French ancestors, but that wasn't what was primary. What she wanted to communicate was this sense of transcending these nationalist emphases and really appreciating being part of a growing diversity around.
And that was true for more than half of the parents
yes.
that you interviewed.
Yes.
And if anybody was going to emphasize minority heritage, they tended to be Black Britons.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that was striking, and I think that Black white people comprised roughly half the sample, so there are more of them than the other types of mixed people. But the people who did embrace the idea of a minority upbringing, and it's funny because actually how people say they identified their children didn't always correspond with how they said they were raising them. So some people who identified their children as mixed, who were Black and white in heritage, some of them said that they were emphasizing a minority upbringing. For instance, I'm thinking of this participant who had a white partner. She was Black and white, she had a white partner, and they were both really involved in making a concerted effort to raise the children with an appreciation of Blackness because they were surrounded by whiteness, and they had to work really hard to to remind their children of the fact that, blackness should be valued. And she told me that she even made a point of trying to make sure that she brought, dark-looking black people into the house sometimes, and her children herself. One interesting thing about that family is that her children, she had 3 children, and they varied a great deal in appearance. So one child looked phenotypically white to others, and the other 2 looked mixed, but she insisted that they were all mixed, and she wasn't going to differentiate between the different children on the basis of phenotype.
We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with professor and author Miri Song after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Miri Song, author of Multiracial Parents, Mixed Families, Generational Change, and the Future of Race. What did your respondents say about experiencing racial discrimination in England?
I think that reports of racial discrimination were more pronounced amongst the black-white participants than they were with the others. Although I think that, this is interesting, and this accords with what we find in the US, for instance, but I think that one of the things that was really interesting was that the black-white participants talked, well, not just the black-white participants, a lot of the participants talked a great deal about generational change and how proud they were of how attuned their children were, how their own children were to challenging prejudice and discrimination where they found it, and that they had the confidence to do so, because many of the people I talked to as parents, many of them were middle-aged, and many of them had grown up in settings where their own parents hadn't provided sufficient support or guidance in terms of how to deal with situations where they might have been racially targeted. So the parents were this is admittedly a pretty educated middle-class sample, but the parents were really, really attuned to these factors, and particularly the black-white participants.
And trying to be on top of it and preparing their children for what they might encounter.
Absolutely, yeah.
Did these parents have any racial preferences regarding their children's future partners?
Yes, I would say yes, but many of them said no. And I think what's so interesting.
Okay, interesting.
I think this is so interesting because, a lot of people, when you ask them something like that, they're very self-conscious and they're very sheepish about admitting that they would have preferences because they feel that it would be racist to say that they had a preference, And I think that I was very interested in this, and I had to probe with a few people. And there are a few people who were kind of umming and ahhing. A few brave souls did say things like, for instance, I had this one participant. This is just one example. She was a black-white woman in her late 40s, and she had a white partner, and her children were, of course, mixed. And she said she was talking about the fact that her son had a white Irish partner, and she said, sometimes I think about the fact that their child, if they have a child, will be probably completely white, and that just makes me feel really strange, makes me feel really weird, and it was upsetting to her, and she was uncomfortable with the fact, she struggled with the fact that she knew she shouldn't feel that way. That's what she said. She felt she shouldn't feel that way. And yet she had to admit to herself that it upset her, this idea of dilution. And this theme of dilution was so strong across
dilution of the ethnic, the minority
exactly,
identity.
Because 46 out of those 62 people had white partners. And if their children themselves, leaned white in terms of dating or already had white partners, then this was a real issue. And there was this one Chinese white participant in the study, and who I'll call Rose, and she had a white husband, and she had 2 children, and she said that when her sons were born, she was stunned because they were blonde and really, really fair, and she felt that she felt erased, and that she felt really upset that her children looked that way and did not reflect her in any way. So I think there's a real anxiety about this idea, the sense of responsibility too, to somehow maintain and cherish their minority ancestry, but it's very difficult.
So if there was a preference, it tended to be for the minority.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting because there were a few people, there were a few people who said that, I remember there was this one Chinese white woman who said that she didn't really want her daughters to partner with Chinese men because she thought that that Chinese men traditionally were very dominant, okay, and were not into equal roles. But other than that, I would say most people rued the idea of loss and cultural loss. Yeah.
Yeah, and you point out in the book that if there continues to be animus towards an ethnic group in England, it tends to be towards Muslims as opposed to blacks.
Well, sorry, do you want me to speak?
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one does not want to discount the continuing forms of prejudice and discrimination against people who are black or part black in England. That is still very real, unquestionably. But I think it's taken a different turn in the sense that the real problematic other, as seen as cultural and religious others who are seen as a threat to civil society, who are seen as strange, and at odds with what are seen as Western liberal values, are seen as Muslims and not black people.
What surprised you most about what you learned from this study?
I think I was genuinely surprised that that everybody that I interviewed seemed so, well, not everybody, but that so many people were so invested in the idea of multiraciality, invested in the idea of mixed, and invested in the idea of trying to register different kinds of, different lineages. And I think that's interesting. The other thing that, despite shared ancestries, the other thing that I thought was interesting was that a lot of people many of the people who were in this study are very educated people, and they could say things like, well, I know that race is socially constructed, it's not real, it's something that we as people created, and we're dealing with racist categories. At the same time, what surprised me is that they could then say in the next breath, yes, but my son is only a quarter this, and my daughter is only an eighth that. So they would at the same time subscribe to racial fractions and the idea of these fractions, and there being perhaps less or more legitimate claims to minority attachments or whatever based on these racial fractions. So I think that we're still really, really caught up in these ideas of fractions and being able to legitimate who we are in that way.
Some Americans would argue that one of the reasons Donald Trump was elected president following Barack Obama is because non-Hispanic white Americans, who are currently 63% of the U.S. population, and that number is dropping and scheduled to drop even lower, are afraid of so-called minorities taking over. In the United Kingdom, 87% of the population is white. Do you think perhaps one of the reasons that there seems to be greater acceptance of interracial marriage and mixed-race children is because Britons are not threatened so much by people of color taking over?
I think that in the U.S. the threat, if you will, has still been culturally and historically been around the idea of black contamination. I mean, given the enormous legacy of slavery in this country and the one-drop rule of hyperdescent, I think that you have such entrenched pockets of deep racial hatred against black people in the US in a way that it's just not the same in England. I think that, yes, there is prejudice and dislike, of course, of other types of people as well. In England, I think that for a whole series of complicated reasons, and I can't do it historical justice, there were not the same kinds of barriers and fears. But I think that, and I think that many places in England, if you look in the cities, for instance, London, a lot of public housing, there's a lot more kind of mixing also of class, so that, for instance...
That you don't have here.
I mean, you can be walking in Harrods and you could turn the corner and you could be public housing not too far from there. And there's a way in which class mixing as well has, I think, contributed to if you will, a rather more balanced society. I don't want to give an overly, rosy-hued picture of Britain, but I don't think that there is that same kind of fear, no.
Okay. It was all very interesting, and I look forward to your future research on this issue. We're out of time. I want to thank Miri Song for joining me today. Her book, Multiracial Parents, Mixed Families, Generational Change, and the Future of Race, published by NYU Press, is available online and in bookstores now. For One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.